Welcome, everyone. My name is Jessica Newworth. I am the director of the Human Rights Program at Roosevelt House Hunter College here in New York. And we are very pleased to be hosting this panel on virtual meeting platforms, government control, and corporate compliance. We were inspired to pull this discussion together, which I think is a very timely one, by an article that was written in the New York Times by Paul Moser about an event or series of events that happened in connection with the commemoration of the Tiananmen Square massacres in June. And I was certainly shocked to see that there was some interference with those commemorations. As all of you know, we're all online now all the time and very dependent on Zoom and other platforms to communicate with each other. And in this instance, it seemed there had been some discussion between Zoom and the government of China, who did not want these discussions to go forward, and some of them were canceled, and one of the participants was suspended from Zoom temporarily. And Paul certainly might have helped by bringing light to that issue, which is a freedom of expression issue, among other things. So we're very honored to have Paul Moser, who wrote that article, with us, and Teng Biao and Erica Basu. I want to introduce them, and we'll then turn it over to Paul Moser, who is the tech correspondent at the New York Times and will be moderating this panel. Teng Biao is a well-known human rights dissident from China, president of China Against the Death Penalty, now in the United States, and we're very privileged to have him as a Grove Scholar for human rights at Roosevelt House. And Dr. Erica Basu, who's coming to us from India. I should have mentioned that Paul Moser's joining us from Hong Kong, and I want to thank both of them for getting up early and joining us. Taipei, I'm sorry, Taipei. Dr. Erica Basu is a researcher and adjunct lecturer at the American University's School of Communication, and she's joining us from India. And we will, I'll turn it over to them for panel presentations and discussion amongst themselves. And then at the end, we would be very glad to have questions from all of you. Feel free to use the Q&A for that purpose. And again, thanks to all of our panelists, and welcome. And I'll leave it with you, Paul.
Okay, thanks. So I think I'm going to just really quickly run through the narrative of what happened, just so people kind of have it clear in their heads, and then we'll kick it to the panelists. So if you were in China as the virus kind of broke out earlier this year, feels like a long time ago, in January and February, as Zoom kind of rose to prominence as this way to meet, to get around the virus, it was surprising to a lot of people in China, because in China, there are very few communications tools that actually allow you to communicate directly online from China to the world. WhatsApp is blocked, Facebook is blocked, Gmail is blocked, Twitter is blocked, on and on. There's what we call a great firewall up that effectively stops communication going in an easy way across the Chinese border. And as Zoom got popular, and this happens every so often, when a new digital tool becomes hugely popular, there's not the kind of system of censorship in place to stop communications along those lines. And so all of a sudden, Zoom opened up this sort of channel that hadn't really existed for a while. And people were hosting seminars and talking. And it was this little kind of weird workaround to the Great Firewall. And so in that context, as that was happening, a number of Chinese activists and survivors of the Tiananmen massacre set about sort of doing what they do each year in the summer on June 4th, which is organizing events to commemorate what happened in 1989. And as they did this, advertisements spread within the Chinese internet in places like WeChat and Weibo, as well as overseas. And what you got was a really fascinating coming together of the Chinese community within China and the community outside of China to talk about these issues. But all for naught, because as those calls started to get set up and happen, they started getting suspended and cut down. One call was actually hijacked in the middle and shut down. In another case, an activist, Zhou Fengsuo's account was suspended. And this was an American company with a number of callers from America, some from China, responding to anger and policies from the Chinese police about what can be said in China. Now, the company then came out, apologized, and said it was working on basically building parallel systems, one in which Chinese can sort of talk to Chinese and foreign, people outside of China can talk to people outside of China, and the two don't necessarily meet, which is what many companies have done. But it kind of struck to the heart of this question of, in a world where we think about the internet as this global communications tool, China has largely cut itself off, and oftentimes it has the leverage and power to dictate terms with companies that want to do business there. And for a company like Zoom, that was a very important market. So that's kind of where we were, and we can get more into the details. But at that moment, I think it opened a lot of people's eyes once again to the sort of controls on communications within China, and oftentimes the very sort of unwillingness companies that you would expect to stand up to this actually are, have to doing that. So now I'll kick it over to Tung Biao first, and just, love to hear what he has to say about the incident and more broadly about kind of what it said to him about how we think about these things.
Thank you very much. So in late May this year, I'm one of the organizers and presenters of the event commemorating Tiananmen Massacre. It's the 31st anniversary of Tiananmen Massacre. And then after that global conference, Zhou Fengshuo's one of the organizers' Zoom account was suspended, and there's another Tiananmen Zoom event was severely interrupted. So so I can give some more examples that the online meeting platforms and other. I will also discuss some other social media, Twitter, Facebook, and the tech giants, Google, Apple, that we our life heavily rely on. Zoom. Zoom's R&D team researchers are all based in China. And if those people are asked by Chinese government to hand over their program code or their clients' information, I don't think they have the guts to say no. And so Zoom's executes is they are following the local rules, the local laws. So I'll discuss that later. In 2004, the internet communication software Skype rolled out a Chinese version called Tomskype in China. And researchers show that Tomskype installed a filter to delete or block sensitive content of text chat. And Mark Zuckerberg is trying everything to push Facebook into the Chinese market. Twitter appointed AI expert Fei Li to its board as an independent director. And this person has close links to the Chinese Communist Party. In 2003, Microsoft joined the Chinese Ministry of Public Security in establishing a joint laboratory providing the Chinese government with the most advanced surveillance equipment and imaging technology. Microsoft, Google, and Yahoo and others all use the various methods to help the Chinese government inspection and control of information. And the companies like Intel, Blue Coat, WebSense, and Knotel, and many others provided the Chinese government with internet monitoring and filtering techniques. Among them, Cisco is the worst. Cisco provided technology, equipment, and training to the Chinese government. So it contributed a lot to the Great Firewall. So we can say without the technology and equipment of Cisco, the GFW, Great Firewall, won't be so powerful and effective. A few years, 2 years ago, Google began its plan called Project Dragonfly. It's a secret plan of search engine that kowtows to the Communist Party's censorship and the surveillance. And that aroused the concern of human rights violations among the human rights communities, and deeply involved in the campaign against the Google's Dragonfly. And under the pressure from all over the world, Google dropped its project. And Apple, a series Chinese version. There's a anecdote. If you ask Siri, Chinese version, what is Tiananmen incident, and Siri will tell you, I don't know, and if you ask them again, and they'll tell you, I couldn't find any appointment related to Tiananmen. And you ask what happened on June 4th, 1989. They said, I'm sorry, the person you are looking for is not in your address book. So kind of that. And if you ask them how to drive to Tiananmen Square, they also have no answer. And Apple stored its data in China. The only partner of the iCloud China is a company which has close connection with Chinese Communist Party. The chair of Apple iCloud partner used to be a high-level government official. And Yahoo has most terrible case that is Shitao case. So when Chinese state security asked Yahoo for its clients' information, and Yahoo provided this information to Chinese spy, this is state security, and that led to at least 4 Chinese bloggers and dissidents into prison, and they were sentenced. Shitao was sentenced to 10 years. So there are so many such cases, the social media and the tax act. And one final point I want to make here is Zoom and Yahoo and Google. So when they were criticized that they involved in human rights violation and suppression of freedom in China, they said they just follow the local laws. But China is not a country with rule of law, and if they care about the Chinese law, they should respect Chinese constitution, which guarantees free speech and freedom of information. And the order that Yahoo or Zoom received from Chinese government officials may not be a legal order. Sometimes it's kind of a random phone call. But if they follow the law, it's not necessary for them to give information to Chinese authorities or to shut down somebody's account. So Yeah, and yeah, I'll stop here.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh.
So, I mean, I think that was a fantastic layout of just the incredible amount of sort of integration with, in particular, American technology companies over the years into what has become, something that I think people need to kind of take a moment and understand is, China has an entire bureaucracy now, an entire police force, an entire system of technologies all designed to control the internet. And it's quite successful. It's quite capable of stopping people from talking about all kinds of issues, from stopping them from seeing foreign media, foreign websites. And if you blab too loud on Chinese social media, the police can knock at your door. That's something we've seen more and more in recent years. And we actually think that may be what happened with Zoom. So, we see the Americans doing this, and we see companies that are incredibly powerful with tremendous amounts of money, in one of the most powerful country in the world doing this. Erica is going to take us, I think, to the global south for a little bit and talk about, China is aggressive in pushing, its narrative towards the United States and towards sort of, first world democracies, but it's also incredibly focused on looking all over the world to push its ideas and its outlook, and it has oftentimes far more leverage in the global south. So Erica, why don't you take us away and describe a little bit about this debate that's happening elsewhere outside of the United States and China?
Okay. Thank you so much, Paul. Good evening to everyone in the United States, and good morning from India. And for those of us from this side of the time zone, good morning as well. I'm delighted really to be on this panel, which is most timely and relevant, because we've seen around the world really in recent years, governments have been trying to take back control and regulate what was being perceived by them and framed as the Wild West of cyberspace. Simultaneously, governments have also embraced tech solutions to make their own departments and agencies more efficient, more responsive to citizens, and ostensibly less wasteful. And we've seen the rise of ideas such as smart cities all over the world. There is a third part to this puzzle, which I would like to call tech resistance, which has seen the rise of civil society around the world to uphold the digital rights of end users based on global frameworks of human rights, freedom of speech and assembly, and privacy concerns. As others have mentioned, the pandemic has certainly thrown into sharp focus how the internet and internet-enabled technologies, such as virtual meeting rooms and social networking sites, have become the backbones really on which our very intimate, personal, social, professional, economic, and political lives now depend. And so at this point, I really would like to go a little kind of on the larger picture and recognize that what started as a communication platform, and this has been very ably discussed by internet governance scholar Dr. Laura Denardis, who was also my advisor, that we have moved from these platforms being platforms of communication to them becoming platforms of control. And these are not just controlled by government, but this is also controlled by the private sector platforms themselves. And at the heart of these models of platform control is the fact that they're based on the continuous collection, sharing, processing of discrete points of individual user data. And this data is then used as predictive models, more efficient models to predict human behavior. And so one of the things that I do want to highlight right here is that these predictive models and by both the private sector and the state are not just things that we see in totalitarian regimes like China and Russia and other such countries, but we are increasingly seeing this kind of reliance on technology to find solutions and to predict user behavior in democracies as well. And I include the United States and India in that grouping. In India, particularly as one of the largest democracies from the global south, this is happening within a larger movement where the space for civic dissent is narrowing considerably. And so when we look at the kind of control that the state has on online behavior and online speech, we should not disregard that this is happening within an overall kind of narrowing of the space for civic dissent. The second point I'd like to touch on is that to recognize that these arrangements of technological architecture and technological cooperation between the state and the private sector are inherently kind of arrangements of power. And so the power that the state and the private sector can exert over the end users is incredible, it's asymmetrical, and this is something that must be kind of kept in mind when we are discussing these issues, the power relations between the actors. And the third point I'd mention is that tech policies also happen within a larger ecosystem of policymaking. And the recent kind of pushback that we've seen from India against Chinese apps and Chinese platforms that have been making serious inroads into the Indian online social media platforms has to do a lot with its foreign policy objectives and the recent border skirmishes between India and China, which is ongoing for decades. So to understand that sometimes these tech policies are now becoming the next frontier of not just foreign policy objectives, but also national security and national kind of economic policy objectives, in terms of if you see it happening between China and the United States. And before I end the kind of my opening remarks, I just want to highlight some things from India as a representative country of the global south, is that it is considered, at least nominally, to be the world's largest democracy. So to understand that this system of control and surveillance is not, democracies are not exempt from it, that it's happening in democracies. The increased government regulation of big tech while continuing to uphold the tenets of corporate surveillance mechanisms is rampant in India, with the use of facial recognition technologies, AI-based technologies. And outside of China, India is currently the world's largest internet user base. So if this is happening in the world's largest democracy, it should give us kind of cause to pause a little bit and think about how we're framing the rhetoric around surveillance and state kind of control. India also remains Facebook's largest user base, WhatsApp's largest user base, and the Indian government in 2014 embarked on its flagship Digital India initiative to transform India using digital tools and a knowledge-based economy. At the same time, India has the notoriety of having the largest number of internet shutdowns in the world. And at a time when we are talking about the internet being kind of the gateway to communication for people around the world, India remains kind of, at the top of that list of blocking communications online. And this is done quite arbitrarily, oftentimes using national security as the reason for why regions have to be shut down, and that it is done in a patchy way. So as you possibly know, that the state of Kashmir has been in a state of virtual internet shutdown for months now, possibly the world's longest internet shutdown. So yeah, so before I end, I do want to, while we are looking at and focusing on, the Zoom incident and the Chinese government, to also recognize that this is a global phenomenon and it is happening all over the world and in democracies as well. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So let's kick off the conversation here. I kind of drew the short straw and said I'd play a bit of devil's advocate and defend Zoom a bit. And I do think there is a way to look at this where, some of the platforms are incredibly powerful, right? I mean, companies like Facebook and Google have just a tremendous amount of power. And in some ways, the best way to think about them is almost at the level of a nation state actor. But ultimately, when you push really hard and you talk to companies about some of this stuff, they say they really don't have the power that countries have, in particular to operate, when you're operating across countries. And so if, Zoom is a great example because this is not a large company, right? I mean, this is a kind of up and coming company, but still pretty small, struggling with a huge amount of new success. It doesn't really have the kind of processes in place to deal with something like requests from Chinese law enforcement, while also dealing with huge cybersecurity concerns that had risen on the back of just massive new traffic, right? And so to some degree, I think something that companies argue is that, well, there's no precedent for us to deal with. I mean, if the United States believes so strongly in principles of freedom of speech, if Europe does, if the democracies around the world do, why is there no, allegiance or group of countries that give us something that we can follow in a meaningful way that actually has muscle and can help us to push back? And what I've, observed over 10 years of following this within China is that oftentimes companies are left to play in this game that is a very, very dangerous, very difficult game of high geopolitics. And so you have CEOs who are 31-year-old hackers in hoodies out of Silicon Valley, meeting with the top police chief, who's a thuggish apparatchik of 40 years of intelligence experience, and they have to sit down with these guys and talk them through why they're going to ignore this and that, and oftentimes their employees are threatened. As Tung Biao brought up, Zoom has plenty of employees in China. If those employees were to say no to the Chinese government, we know what would potentially happen to some of those employees. So I guess I'm curious, either of you, whoever wants to take this, if you were in Zoom's position and you have all these employees in China who have their families and their own lives kind of, in your hands in terms of you making these decisions, how would you make those decisions? And what is an ideal way what is a perfect path to kind of help these companies make decisions that are in favor of freedom of speech and allowing for kind of open communications?
Okay, I'll just jump in over here. And companies like Zoom just don't end up in China just out of the blue. They completely understand the geopolitics of what China and countries like India stand for. They know the political and economic structure into which they're entering. And so I'll push back a little against your defense of tech companies like Zoom in saying that, they're helpless and, while they find themselves in a situation where they they're caught between, a rock and a hard place. But they are fully cognizant of countries. I don't for a moment believe that techno companies, or any company for that matter, enters another country to operate without full knowledge of the political, legal, social conditions of that country in which they are going to. To give them the free pass and say, they're in a bit of a tough situation is being a little lenient. I think the point you raise about this sector being extremely young, in terms not just about the age of the top executives in these companies, but the sector itself is an extremely young sector. So I do take your point about that it is an evolving space, and we are going to see continuous pushback, cooperation, confrontation, and I think one of the kind of self-regulatory aspects that tech companies do take up in terms of publishing transparency reports, reports of what kind of government requests they get for information, to make all that publicly available is a good step. And I completely agree that corporations rely on the rule of law and legal frameworks within countries. And so that this is a time for states to be very mindful of the kind of legislations that they're putting in place.
Yeah, so Zoom is not following Chinese law when it suspended the organizer's Zoom account. The owner Zhou Fengshui is a Chinese dissident, but he's an American citizen. He did that work in the United States, so there is not a single article in a Chinese law requiring a foreign company to close an account of a foreign citizen because they did something on foreign soil. Yeah, so Zoom's founder and director is a Chinese national. He went to the United States when he was 27. That means he has a lot of connections in China, his family, relatives, friends. Chinese government is easy to give pressure to him and his employees. So the decision to put all I&D team in China is wrong. I agree with Erica. So they are aware the whole thing, the political and legal system, and the social and the society and the culture. And they are Zoom publicly is proud of their decision to put their R&D in China, because they lower their cost greatly. But I would say a company like Zoom or other tech, no matter it's a small company or a big company, they have to care about their reputation. And the business people care about money, but reputation related to money, right? And in the long run, they have to consider the basic standard of CSR, this corporate social stability, and there's the international standard of corporate social stability, and they have to consider the basic principle. And the money is important, but it's not everything.
So yeah, the Zoom founder is an American citizen, just to just sort of.
Yeah, he's an American citizen.
So I think one of the things that in Zoom's case, they would argue is that some of the systems which you would normally have set up to have internet services exist both in China and outside of China had not been kind of fully put into place. And that was what I was alluding to at the beginning when I talked about how in China, all of a sudden, this channel of communication opened up that linked the world. Now, the thing is, a lot of companies have done this. LinkedIn has done this, others as well, where basically you kind of create a two-track system, a system for Chinese and then a system for the world. And the China system that you run is censored. And the China system that you run in particular has the identity of every single user that you can hand over to the government when necessary, this thing called real name registration, which is very important because in China, basically the internet is no longer anonymous. Anybody using any service, that the company is responsible for being able to hand over the identity of that person to the government if they ask. And so what we saw happening towards the end of 2019 was Zoom was getting big enough that the Chinese government was starting to force it to do real name registration. But to start a Zoom call, you had to be real name registered. But to join a call, Zoom was able to keep that anonymous. So basically Chinese who were not real name registered on Zoom could dial into calls, but they could not create calls. And so this is what enabled, in some ways, them to connect. And so, Teng Biao, as you said, China doesn't really have rule of law, but it has these kinds of sort of, it does have rules, right? And these rules are enforced when at the kind of whims of the authorities. And so in this case, as Zoom got bigger and bigger, this imbalance, this sort of backdoor that they were able to keep open in a way that allowed people to go anonymous and also connect became, something that was very valuable for dissidents, a way to kind of link communities in the United States and in China in a single integrated way, which we just don't really have that opportunity very often. And the Chinese government saw that and went very hard, at shutting it down. And so I guess my question is, Zoom could say now, oh, we fixed it. If no Chinese would have been on that call in the first place, because now our systems are in place and they're right? So now no Chinese person could call into a Tiananmen call set up in the United States. And Zoom would say, see, we're done, we fixed it, all is well. What are both of you guys? I wonder what you think about that, this balkanized version of the internet, where companies offer China one standard and one system, and then the world a different one. And under that rubric, what we saw happen, this past summer with the Tiananmen stuff just never would have happened at all. But to me, it still represents another issue. And I'm curious what you think about that, the way these kinds of rules are being hardwired into the way the internet functions.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question, Paul, because I think that that's really where it lies at currently around the world. We are seeing a kind of move away from a global communication system and a universal internet that follows the same rules everywhere to what people have started calling a splinternet, and different regions, different countries imposing local laws, local rules to regulate how online communication and behavior is conducted within their borders. And so is it time, so my question is it time then to leave that rhetoric of global internet behind and come to terms with the reality of a splintered communication system that is backed by the internet for sure, but kind of performs as per the requirements of local governments. And in that sense, then we should give up the hypocrisy and the rhetoric around global norm setting, global human rights, global kind of notions of freedom of speech and association, global norms around privacy. Then if we are going to accept that there is no global standard and that, companies do have to rely on local kind of laws and local requirements, which Teng Bao was right, that there are a lot of times there isn't a real legal framework, but there are rules and there are local norms. And like I said in the beginning, the power relations between who is asking and who is complying. And yeah, it's a question for the global internet governance community to come to terms with, in terms of, do we truly have a global internet, or are we right at that cusp of working on a fragmented space?
Yeah, I do wonder if we give up that ideal itself, if we abandon the kind of principles, does that not just give further latitude to both companies and governments to kind of, do what they will, instead of, being able to be held to some standard at some point. Tell me, I'm curious, both, what you make of that the way that China looks at the moment, and also how influential do you think this has been around the world? I think the Chinese government fancies itself an influencer, or would love to be an influencer on kind of internet rules as well. So both, what do you make of on the ground in China, and also how much do you think this is influencing the way the internet is growing?
Yeah, Chinese government is pushing the concept like internet sovereignty to the world. So the so-called China model of internet management, they are trying to export that kind of control, information control to other countries, and that's of course in conflict with the idea of internet, with the idea of universal freedom and the human rights, and China has national security law, internet security law, something. And the purpose of those laws are not to promote free flow of information and free speech, but to limit and control the freedom of information. So here we have to think about some different things. One is the purely violation of human rights, like what Yahoo did. Bloggers and writers were arrested and put into prison because their complicity. That's one thing that's totally unacceptable. And another thing is like Cisco, what Cisco did to facilitate Chinese GFW, and helping Chinese government to tighten its surveillance and the internet control. That's also unacceptable. And then we have to care about the business, the principle of a business, and its social responsibility, and its benefit. How to as a business, how to balance the benefit and abiding by the law and its social responsibility. So those are different things, and they it's not correct. It's not morally right to facilitate China's censorship. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're gonna have Katrina come on in a second and see if we have any questions from the audience, so we can respond to what you guys are thinking.
Sure. So the first question that we have, I'm going to direct it towards Erica. It asks, are there instances where India has not only blocked access, but pressured companies like Zoom to intervene in the same way as China has, or any other countries that you might know of?
In it, I can speak for India.
Mhm.
It has not kind of pressured companies to give up information about its users in the way that they did with Yahoo, and then suspended most recently the suspended Zoom account. But it has asked for kind of information that from companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter, and the companies are to take down content, more to take down content, and the companies have actually been quite good in terms of pushing back against the Indian government and asking for the legal framework or the legal order that asks them to do this, and that they don't comply with just the ask from the government.
Okay, so that's actually a good segue to the next question, which can go out to anyone. It asks, what, if any, regulatory framework is there for these online meetings? Are there any remedies for the interventions by China or Zoom? That can go for whoever.
Remedies. I don't know if it like Zoom suspended American citizens' account. Yeah, I don't know if there's any possible remedies. So I can think of the social movement, social pressure. If a certain company is involved in severe human rights violation, like what Yahoo did in 2005, and people can call for a boycott, and people can criticize this company. That kind of harm to the reputation will give effective pressure, but it's really difficult. Even though, for example, if Google or Twitter, or Facebook is involved in human rights violation, it's difficult for most users to boycott these social media and tech sites.
Yeah, and it's an incredibly imperfect way of doing it as well, because as we see, I mean, you're reliant on a certain case getting enough traction. And Tung Biao has brought up the Yahoo case several times, but nowadays, I mean, Yahoo feels like the quaint old days these days, because there's an internet police force in China that is, daily arresting hundreds of people and pulling them in and questioning them and holding them. And most of these people are not having their identities given up by foreign tech companies, but we honestly just don't even know. And I think that gets to the second point, which is just that there's not really any good guidance system, in part because what we talk about when we would look for that is a multi-stakeholder approach. And that would be a combination of governments and companies and users trying to kind of craft a rules of the road. And the problem is, in terms of a government side, you have China's huge influence, both in the UN and elsewhere, working to push back against anything that would control how a nation state could, say, censor or arrest people for what they say online. And at the same time, you have a bunch of companies who individually are afraid to speak out about this because of fears of the punishments they will receive in China, which remains an important market for many tech companies as well. So they'll hide in industry groups, and so you'll have certain industry groups issue certain ideas, but at the end of the day, without having big tech CEOs that are readily identifiable standing up and saying this is not okay, you simply cannot. You really won't get progress. And there was a remarkable moment where in front of Congress asked a number of US tech CEOs, are any of you aware of IP theft out of China? And they all said, no, we're not really sure of that, including Google's executive leadership, when we know publicly Google stated that it was hacked and technology was taken, and that was part of its decision to leave China and stop censoring its search results back in in the early 2010s. So anyway, yeah, there's not a lot of hope, unfortunately.
I'll jump in over here. So while I do I'm always cognizant of the power asymmetries that happen, and I'm so glad Paul brought up the concept of the multi-stakeholder process, where you do have government, private sector, and users represented by civil society groups and organizations at the table. It's certainly not enough. Just being at the table doesn't mean to say you get the best seating place at the table. So I recognize that, but we do see globally, and I will mention a couple of incidents, a couple of cases in India, where civil society has definitely stepped up and raised enough pressure to enable legal kind of changes to take place. And I'll mention the strong net neutrality laws that exist in India, when civil society literally stood up against a giant like Facebook, and the Indian government was forced to reconsider its net neutrality regulations, which is once again under threat, but that's another story. And there is another organization called the Software Freedom Law Center in India that has an internet shutdown tracker, which is crowdsourced, and they do it themselves, which actually tracks how the Indian government shuts down and restricts communication on the internet. And most recently, the Internet Freedom Foundation, which is another new, more recent civil society organization, has started a crowdsourced project called Project Panoptic that is actually tracking how facial recognition systems are being used and deployed by both the central government and state governments in India to make people aware and to demand the kind of accountability that we expect from both our governments and the private sector that works in our countries.
Mm-hmm. Wow, okay, yeah, thank you all for that. I think we only have time for one last question. And I think Paul might know the answer to this because you mentioned this earlier. It asks, do countries other than China have real name registration requirements? Is that a thing, or is that just a Chinese thing?
You can oftentimes figure out who people are, and the companies do keep this information oftentimes. I mean, the way that Google and Facebook and these other companies do such expert ad tracking is that they have a good sense of who you are based on a huge amount of information. So usually what would happen is that if a government wanted information, say in a democracy wanted information about somebody, they could push, Google and Facebook or Twitter and say, we want information on this person or on this IP address or off of this phone, this account, that kind of thing. And they'll give the information depending on whether they think it's a valid request or not. But nobody, as far as I know, outside of maybe North Korea, have truly, as comprehensive an understanding of the actual, specific individual behind any given account. And this is because you actually need a phone number to register any account in China, and your phone number is linked to your ID number. You cannot get a SIM card unless you give an ID. And that system, that sort of, you can't get a cell plan unless you have unless you give an identity. That does exist around. So it is around. It's just very few places are as kind of like overwhelmingly authoritarian and calculated about how they want to use this to control people. But I don't think, I think this will probably going forward be a model for other countries. So. Stay tuned for more of it, I'm sure.
Right. All right. So
Yeah,
on that, go ahead.
I'll step in over there and say that, tech companies there are certain tech companies that do have real name registration policies. Facebook, and I'm going to mention Facebook because it is the largest and most powerful. Facebook actually has a real name policy. It's another thing whether it is enforced or not, but by policy, they have it. So if They are asked to take down information because the person has not complied with the real name policy. They do have that option because it is a policy of Facebook that you have to register with your real name. It's another thing that is not probably enforced as stringently as the real name policy in China, but to remember that it is part of the policy, and so at a time when they have to enforce it, they do have that right to enforce it because it is their policy.
Yeah, I may make a final point, which is not directly related to this question. The social media like WeChat and Weibo, so those are totally controlled by the Chinese government. But like Zoom, the Chinese government can interfere Zoom activity. They gave instructions to Zoom to interrupt a sensitive event. Not only because Zoom's complicity, but also because Chinese government has a broad network in other countries. Like people are talking about Confucius Institute, Chinese Students and Scholars Associations, CSSAs, and Townsmen's Association or Chamber of Commerce, alumni associations, and a lot of such influence operations. And Chinese government has that network of spies and informants providing the information to Chinese authorities, and that's why it's functional.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that, Tung Biao. And thank you, Erica, and thank you, Paul. I'm going to pass it along now to Jessica Newworth to close us off.
Yeah, I mean, also thanks from me to all of you for such an informative and thoughtful conversation. It's just all kinds of ideas whirling around my mind. And, I think Paul mentioned how new this is, this whole, or all of you mentioned how new this is. And I'm thinking, I remember life before the internet. I remember life before email. And I remember growing up when nobody had a computer even. So either I'm really old or this is really new, or both. And there's so many questions, and you've raised and talked about a lot of them. And I think there's just a lot more questions than answers right now. But it's important for us to explore all these questions. And someone mentioned internet sovereignty, which is hard to think about because of the way in which the internet is just the ultimate globalization. So I find myself as a lawyer thinking, are the traditional concepts of sovereignty under international law just kind of completely outdated, as evidenced by so dramatically by this online global communication context? Or are we going to start imposing, our old thinking on these new technologies and come up with, like splinternet is a whole new word for me. So I have a lot to think about here, but and I'm sure everyone listening as well. So so really, thank you so much for joining us from all around the world, using this incredible technology and giving us a lot to think about. And in particular, I think when someone asked about remedies, and Teng Biao basically said it's public pressure. That's our only remedy right now. We don't have treaties. We don't have all of that. So I want to also particularly thank Paul Moser for writing about all of this and bringing it to light, and Teng Biao for your courage and lifelong commitment to freedom of expression, and Erica for all the work that you've done. So thanks to all of you. Thanks to everybody who joined us to watch, and have a great evening or morning wherever you are. Take care, and everyone take care and stay safe.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.